The UK's new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is showing off, some say flaunting, a new team of diverse ministers. Do the optics make a difference, or are they nothing more than a mirage? Welcome to Roundtable. And a very warm welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. It's being labelled a cabinet for modern Britain, with ministers from diverse backgrounds. Certainly looks good. But for a Prime Minister who's been accused of making racist remarks, there are those wondering if this is simply token representation.
It's the picture of diversity. Britain's new Home Secretary Priti Patel, Sajid Javid, the newly appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Kwasi Kwarteng, Minister for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, ministers of Asian and African descent in the country's most powerful positions. It's not just Britain. Italy named its first black cabinet minister in 2013, and the United States now boasts the most ethnically diverse Congress to date, with a record number of women representatives too. But all this comes amongst a backdrop of divisive behaviour and demeaning comments right from the top. Boris Johnson calling children in the Commonwealth flag-waving pickaninnies, and President Donald Trump famously referring to Mexicans as rapists. So in this new era of politics, is it still a win for minority representation?
Very pleased to say that on the line from Warwick, somewhere north of here, that is in the UK's Midlands, Shirin Rai, Professor of Politics at the University of Warwick. At the round table, we welcome Claudia Webb, a member of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, and Shabnam Nasimi, who is Director of the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan. So we cross the political divide here, but I think you're united, certainly at this table and probably up in Warwick as well, in saying more always needs to be done. But my question, first of all, Claudia, I'll put this one to you. If Boris Johnson hadn't done this, he would have been damned, and now he's being damned for doing it. He can't win.
Well, the reality is the democratic deficit that we have in terms of UK politics has to be addressed. And of course, it's absolutely right that Boris should choose from amongst his party and choose people that he feels that will represent the Conservative Party. The fact that they're diverse, you know, I don't know whether Boris actually took that into consideration. The reality is, does it change anything? Does it change the fundamental experience?
But he's being condemned for doing this as a token gesture. Do you have any sympathy with that?
I'm not sure that I have any particular sympathy with that. I think that Boris himself and what he stands for and what he represents and what he's said over time has certainly not helped race relations in the UK and has certainly damaged race relations in the UK. The fact that he makes this gesture to people from within the party, black minority ethnic people within the party and parliamentarians, I think is to be welcomed from that point of view. But does it actually change anything in terms of black minority ethnic representation in politics?
Well, it must do. Certainly in terms of numbers, it must do. But I just want to throw this one out here. First of all, for you, and you can pick it up in Warwick if you like as well. So many articles written about this, and I've just selected a few quotes. A writer in The Guardian says, "This is a fixation on diversity over racial equality." In what sense?
Well, first of all, we can't deny the fact that this is Boris Johnson has assembled one of the most ethnically diverse cabinets in British history. And what is striking about this cabinet is people who, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, the Chancellor of Exchequer, who would have once been considered outsiders, have now been entrusted with some of the most important posts in government. Diversity. Now, of course, there are a lot of work to be done in terms of how we ensure that this diverse cabinet impacts everyday Britain's life, to ensure that they leave a legacy and actually make a difference. But let's not underestimate the impact that this will make.
Well, what impact do you think it will have?
Well, first of all...
Shirin, we'll come to you in just a second. I'm so sorry. I know you're dying to say something.
Sure. So my work with BME communities for almost a decade has shown me that seeing someone who looks like you, who comes from the same background as you, particularly for young people, makes a huge difference and is very much transformative in believing that if they are up there, then so can I. And one of the amazing things that makes Britain so great, and a lot of the time, for people who, for a twist of fate, may have grown up somewhere else, like myself, who originally comes from, my family have come from Afghanistan, you realize that what characteristics and what values that we hold here in the UK that are not found elsewhere, and that include equality of opportunities, tolerance, respect, and the fact that the British dream is very much alive and thriving. Despite where you come from, your race, the colour of your skin, it's about the merits and it's about your talents.
I know you probably want to come in on that, Claudia, but I'm going to go to Shireen up in Warwick. The same writer I quoted goes on to say, the appointment of Priti Patel and Sajid Javid, Home Secretary, Chancellor, etc., does not represent a step forward for people of colour. I can't understand why that would be the case.
Well, I think there are two things to say here. One is that the question of identity is not just about identity and color. So the question is, what is the politics of the people who have been chosen by Boris Johnson to sit in his cabinet? So I would agree that the politics of ethnic minority members of parliament, as well as of Boris Johnson's cabinet, matters. So when Priti Patel says she wants people to feel terror when, before thinking of breaking the law in any way, that shows us the alignment of politics within that cabinet. So that's the first point.
Well, let me just throw this one at you. She'd be a pretty funny Home Secretary if she said she wanted people to feel comfortable before they committed a crime.
No, but that's very different from terror and comfortable. Nobody's saying that people should feel comfortable in breaking the law, but she has in the past also said she'd bring back the capital punishment, or she
says she's changed her mind.
Yeah, so maybe so.
Which we're allowed to do in politics.
My question, my point there really is, David, that we very often overlook the intersection of politics and ethnicity, politics and gender, when we talk about representation in terms of identity. And we need to be clear that these people are obviously part of the Tory party, obviously part of a particular wing of the Tory party. And therefore, the earlier comment by my colleague there, that what is going to change is not necessarily because of their ethnicity, but because of the policies adopted by them.
You see, this brings me back, Shireen, and we'll come to you in just a moment, but let me throw this out to each one of you, because you can say what you like, whenever you like. These are complaints about Boris and his cabinet are not about the ethnicity, they are simply about the politics of those concerned.
Well, it's absolutely right for us to question whether or not having black minority ethnic people in high office changes anything, fundamentally changes anything for black and minority ethnic communities on the ground.
You're arguing every single day for more black and minority ethnic people to be in there, and yet you're saying, on the other hand, you've got to question whether it changes anything.
No, but the politics of what effectively that we have means that we have generational unemployment for black and minority ethnic communities, poverty out of the sky, a level of discrimination and hate that has risen beyond figures that we've ever known. The reality is it's not changed the fundamental basis on which defines black communities in this country. And to say that even black communities, black minority communities will be inspired by individuals in high office, I don't think that necessarily follows, because we've had black minority ethnic people in Parliament for some significant amount of time. We've seen, for example, Diane Abbott, Paul Boateng and so on. 20, 30 years ago, and the level of democratic deficit when it comes to racial equality has not increased in that period of time.
Okay,
we are still facing a level of inequality
take this one
that is not
I'll come to you in just a moment, if I may. There's as much ethnic diversity around the cabinet table as under the last 4 prime ministers put together. A decade ago, 2 ethnic minority MPs at that point. Now there's a British Asian Chancellor and a Home Secretary among half a dozen non-white MPs at the cabinet table, things have changed.
Well, not for the vast majority of people on the ground in communities that are facing levels of inequality, facing levels of poverty. There is not a feeling that change has happened. There is not a feeling that if you are black, young male in this society, that you will be able to rise to a level that's recognisable according to your abilities and according to your worth.
But I really don't understand how you can say that when you only have to point at these two cabinet ministers to say that this is attainable.
Because your chances of continued, for example, discrimination on the ground, levels of stop and search, levels of poverty still remain the same in Britain under the Conservative Party. The reality is that we've had austerity since 2010.
But you're saying this is all about how you don't like the Conservative Party, how you dislike inequality. And I totally understand that. This isn't, your argument is nothing to do with the diversity of the cabinet.
But does the diversity create a level of political difference for black and minority ethnic communities?
Well, look, I think trumpeting the achievements...
Sorry, back in Warwick in just a moment.
Trumpeting the major achievements when it comes to the British political system and representation really does not, in my opinion, will not improve the situation for BME communities. I think political opinions and perspectives aside, this is a major achievement in Britain's history. The second point I'd like to make is this idea that if you believe anything out of the norm, anything out of what people naturally assume BME communities to the values that they should hold or the ideology they should hold, particularly from the left, it seems very discouraging that if you hold contrary or contrasting opinions, that you are either not Asian enough, that you are not BME enough, and that you're not going to be standing to support your own communities. First of all, we need to see this cabinet as British members of parliament and British cabinet members. Of course, they come from ethnic backgrounds, they come from BME backgrounds, but they are British first and foremost. And they will work just as hard as anyone else to improve our society, to ensure that it continues to thrive.
I'm really interested in one of the points that you made. And Shireen, I'm going to come to you here. Say what you want to say first, and then I've got a point to put to you that came out of what Shabnam just said.
No, what I wanted to say was that it is absolutely right that we should encourage and celebrate more ethnic representation in our parliament, as we do for more women in parliament. The reason for that is what has already been said, that it becomes a sort of, it encourages others to join. It shows the people that it is a representative institution, which is really important that we hold on to that. And also, secondly, what it does is that it actually engages the institution itself, right? The parliament, the way in which it works, the way in which people across the diverse spectrum work with each other as members of that institution, that does shift. And there's been a lot of research. I've just published a book on women in the Indian parliament, where the problem is that there are so few women that the parliament functions in very different ways than the British parliament, where it's far away from parity yet. But still, we are seeing some shifts in the way in which women are treated within parliament.
And I want to take this. I want to take this internationally in just a moment. But I want to come back to something that was said in the studio. So let me put this one to you, Shireen. The suggestion here was that this isn't so much about diversity. It's about the fact that people disagree with the views held by those black and minority ethnic people who are now members of the government. In other words, they're trying to foist their own views on these people, their liberal tendencies, perhaps, rather than the right-wing tendencies of these people. They're trying to say, look, these are the wrong type of ethnic minorities.
Yeah, no, I think that it's not a question of that it is a wrong type of ethnic minority. The question is that when we talk about marginalized groups in politics, whether it is women or ethnic minorities, we somehow seem to feel the need to burden them with our own politics. So how will they benefit that particular community. The question, so that can be answered in two different ways. One is to say that it is actually a question of justice. Why is it that it has taken so long for representation in Parliament to be more diverse than it is? And we are still quite far from it being entirely diverse, right? So that is one. It's a simple question of what institutional blockages are there for people to join parliamentary institutions.
I wish we had time to go into that in great depth,
Yeah.
but we're particularly talking about what's happened in the last few weeks.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated by your point. I'll put it to you, Claudia, that you suggest that you are trying to burden them with your own political expectations. They aren't the right sort of blacks or Asians or other ethnic minorities. That's the problem.
No, the reality is that they've been appointed because they hold the values of the Conservative Party.
That's no surprise, so is it?
But that is not in itself a problem. The problem that ensues is when we try to say that this will change the lot of black and minority ethnic communities in this country, and at the kind of progress that we're seeing, it will not change
Is it going to make
the
it
lot.
worse?
Well, it is simply going to say that black and minority ethnic communities have been in Parliament for decades, let's say, and it has taken this long for there to be representation in high office. That is what it's saying very firmly and clearly to black and minority ethnic communities. It cannot say, because we've had a female prime minister, that it's going to improve the lot for women, for example, because it didn't.
Having said that,
and the reality,
decades that the BME communities have been in Parliament, but the Conservative Party is the first government that has chosen to create such a diverse cabinet. So we need to be able to look at that.
We've taken that so far. I would like to look at where Britain is perhaps compared to the rest of the world. And Shireen, I know you've got experience of India. We're going to talk about Afghanistan. Your thoughts on where we stand vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Think about that while I ask you about your time in Afghanistan.
Sure.
You left as an 8 or 9-year-old back in 1999.
Yes.
It's come some way, Afghanistan, then, because the Taliban were in charge there. You weren't allowed really to go to school. And representation at the highest level of women in Afghanistan was extremely poor. Excuse me. How has it changed there? And, well, it has, but how far?
Well, first of all, my family migrated to the UK in 1999, fleeing the Taliban regime for safety, security, and peace in the UK. And I'm incredibly privileged that my father took that decision to build a life here. And the reason I say that is the values that we hold in Britain is world recognized. And sometimes I think we underestimate exactly who we are and what we've achieved as a nation. Afghanistan is ranked one of the worst places to be a woman. And if I had grown up there, I'm pretty sure that I would not have had.
And in terms of ethnicity, there is discrimination as well, isn't there?
There are many challenges when it comes to Afghanistan, and the improvements have been made, particularly with the support of the international community and Britain. More importantly, Britain has invested and supported Afghanistan enormously, and that should be recognized and celebrated. Afghanistan has a long way to go. Contrasting the UK to Afghanistan is, in my opinion, it has no comparison. But when it comes to representation, women's involvement in politics, in public life, it still has a long way to go.
It's gone so far, but it still has a very long way to go. Shireen, let's talk about the bigger international picture. You may want to talk about India, but I'm going to bring up the United States here. 22% of members of the current Congress are from a racial or ethnic minority background compared to a population of 39%. It's going some way. It hasn't actually gone very far at all. And women are, I think it's a quarter of the members of Congress, so 25% vis-a-vis obviously 75% male. How do we in this country compare when we're critical of ourselves with other places such as that?
Well, I think that if we compare ourselves with Afghanistan or the United States or India, on some of these issues, we compare really well. If we compare ourselves with Rwanda and Sweden, then perhaps not so much. So it depends on who you want to compare yourselves, or we want to compare ourselves with.
Okay, well, let me blindly ask you to tell me about Rwanda, because that might not crop up in many conversations about diversity?
Yeah,
Where do we
no,
need to follow an example from there?
Yeah, so Rwanda, because I think they've got now parity for gender parity in their parliament, which is very far from even where Britain is, and definitely very far from where India is, because we are just in India, there is only 14% representation of women, for example. So when we talk about sort of, how wonderful things are here, I think we need to just say where we are in the league of tables on these issues. And the second thing, I think that what is really important about the international, I'm not going to talk so much about the United States, but to go back to our own BME community, that we live in a globalized world, right? And so our BME community is very much affected by what is going on. It's a diaspora. It's a global diaspora. And I remember the time when Narendra Modi came to the UK and...
Sorry, for those that don't know, the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi.
Yeah. Exactly. There's been a huge amount of money sent from the UK to the sort of, political parties in India, and Indian leaders have got sort of, links with communities in this country.
You were part of a study of what was called democracy in the Labour Party. And one of the things that I think you were behind recommending was all minority shortlists for MPs. In other words, a particular seat would only be fought by somebody from a black and minority ethnic background from the Labour point of view. That, in a sense, could set it back. This is just one suggestion, could set it back, diversity to some extent, because people would feel that was reverse discrimination.
Well, I mean, I'm not obviously in America they have something called affirmative action, and obviously that is illegal here in the UK. But what we're talking about is tackling a democratic deficit that needs to be addressed. If the Labour Party hadn't had all women shortlists, we would not have the numbers of women in Parliament that we do today. 49% of Labour women in Parliament, members of Parliament, 49% of members of Parliament are women. That is because of the action and steps that we've taken to bring about change. And without taking that kind of change, then you won't be able to address the democratic deficit. It will be 2090 before we see any progress at the current rate that we're going. So you do need to do something to address the democratic deficit that there is in terms of black and minority ethnic communities in this country.
Okay.
There are not nearly enough representation in politics, in whole swathes of public life. There's very little representation.
Let me bring us back to the original point we were making here. I know you hate his politics. You probably dislike the new Prime Minister as a person, as a personality or whatever. But is there a little bit of a round of applause from you for what he's done in this regard, even if it is only a tiny baby step?
Do you mean in terms of enabling members of Parliament from black minority communities in the Conservative parties to be in top office? As I've indicated, that is to be welcomed, but it doesn't actually change anything. It doesn't actually, for example, 14% of parliamentarians from the Conservative Party are women. That is not nearly good enough. And it can't just... Really...
OK, grudging respect.
No, the reality is it's not nearly good enough. We have to do something to change Parliament and politics.
We'll come to that in another programme, Claudia, and you're invited to be part of that.
Well, we need to reflect the society in which we seek to govern, and in order to do that, you have to make some step changes.
Having come from a society originally, and your grandparents are still there, where women were treated in an appalling way in many ways, how far do you think what Boris Johnson has done with his cabinet is a step forward?
Of course.
For women and for minority.
So, I mean, we've got the race disparity audit, which was immensely important in outlining exactly the inequalities that exist in public sector. But Boris Johnson has taken upon himself to act as a leader, as someone who is a decision maker and responsible in government to implement that change.
Okay.
And I think that's, first of all, any claims of tokenism or the fact that there's a certain quota that needs to be ticked off is completely inappropriate.
It's like asking for a one-word answer when you come to the end of it. I've got to go to Shireen because we've got about a minute left.
I mean, I assume that one would applaud the work that Jeremy Corbyn has done.
So tokenism or recognition of talent?
I think it can be both, because he has absolutely quietly dropped his commitment to Sajid Javid in the debates about Islamophobia in the Tory party. So I think it's the context that matters. But of course, in terms of representation, it is good that we've got such a good representation of ethnic minority people in cabinet.
Well, listen, I do appreciate it. I know there's so much more to say from each and every one of you. From a white male sitting here talking about the disadvantages that each and every one of you faces in daily life. It is a humbling experience, I have to say, and I do appreciate the efforts that are being made. I was not trying to disrespect your views at all, Claudia, and thank you for coming in. Great to hear that your grandparents are doing so well out still in Afghanistan. And Shireen, Indian politics, well, it's a fascinating democracy, biggest democracy in the world. It's going to have its flaws as well as its good points. We appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming on the programme, and thank you for watching. I'm David Foster. You can get more of Roundtable at our YouTube channel. That's TRT World Roundtable on YouTube. Goodbye for now.